Hello, welcome back to my channel. The plan for this month is a two-part video series, one of them being on TERF ideology, aka trans-exclusionary radical feminism, and the second one is going to be on SWERFs. As silly as the name is, it's really awful. Sex work, exclusionary radical feminism. So I'm just gonna get straight into it now. There are plenty of videos and information on the topic of TERFs, but for this video I wanted to specifically focus more on the argument itself that TERFs and a lot of conservatives make. I think it's important for me to practice my breaking down an argument skills, as well as helping or trying to teach you all how to do that too, because it's essential to completely disavowing said arguments. So what is gender critical feminism? Who are these feminists on the front lines defending the status quo? Researcher Aleardo Zangelini, I might have butchered that, states, in general, gender critical feminism advocates reserving women's spaces for cisgendered women. A few, though not all, gender-critical feminists make exceptions for some trans women, such as those who have undergone gender reassignment surgery. Apart from seeing the proposed reform as threatening women's spaces, gender-critical feminists, or many of them, are critical of the use of puberty blockers for self-identified trans children. So in other words, this movement is veiled as, and blatantly and falsely categorized as a kind of feminism. So in order to make this video as clear as possible and as easy to follow, despite the incoherence and lunacy, in my opinion, of anti-trans bigotry, I'm going to break down each point from TERF arguments and explain why they're wrong and why they're not feminist. But before I do, I'll give a very brief historical context to gender critical feminism. When we're talking about the birth of the TERF, an easy time to start is the feminist movement in the 1970s. According to Claire Thurlow, then as now, the most prominent and influential text of trans-exclusionary feminism was Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, The Making of a She-Male. Published in the USA in 1979, it was one of the first texts dedicated to the relationship between trans, specifically transsexual, though I use trans for consistency, womanhood, and feminism. The book sets out the arguments as to why trans identities pose a threat to cisgendered women. A. Trans is a manifestation of patriarchy and is caused, at least in part, by sex role rigidity. B. Trans people are either delusional or deceiving, and to think otherwise is to collude with the falsification of reality. And C. Trans women are violators and penetrators of space, of bodies, and of true womanhood. It's also worth mentioning that almost the entirety of TERF hysteria and fear-mongering is targeted at transgender women. Raymond, for example, rarely if ever touches on any other gender identity beyond that of trans women. However, gender critics nonetheless charge their hatred towards the whole trans community, especially it seems, in most recent years. So do with that what you will. Now, let's get to the arguments themselves. 1. Trans is a manifestation of patriarchy. So this one is unique to TERF ideology because largely conservative movements don't tend to adopt feminism the way that TERF ideology does. This statement relies on two assumptions. A, that gender is in fact innate and not socially constructed. And B, that patriarchy supports transgender women. So neither of these are true if it wasn't obvious from the get-go. First, gender and sex can and do intersect in many cases. However, they are not the same thing, and neither one has to necessarily rely on the other to exist. This diagram that I'm showing right now is from the National Health Institute's And the diagram depicts, for people who may be listening or can't watch the video, sex as anatomy, physiology, genetics, and hormones, and gender as identity, roles and norms, relations, and power. So, very different things, but both are technically social constructs. To answer B, no, patriarchy does not support any transgender people, much less transgender women. A quick Google search of statistics on transgender women and people in any area of concern, to be honest, will show that this couldn't be farther from the truth. If patriarchy did support trans women the way it does support cisgendered men, for example, which is what many TERFs argue because they don't believe that trans women are women at all, then we'd have to state in confidence that transgender people wouldn't be victimized over 4 times more often than cisgender people. Or that 1 in 4 transgender women who were victimized wouldn't have thought that the incident was a hate crime compared to less than 1 in 10 cisgender women. So again, this is just blatant and hateful misinformation. So for the second argument, trans people are either delusional or deceiving. This one is a bit trickier than the other one, because although there is data and empirical evidence in support of trans people not only existing, but for the benefit of them getting proper, say, medical care or mental health care, there's been a lot of discourse over the potential dangers of only legitimizing trans people's existence and experiences with science or because of science. For example, not having to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria in order to receive medical care, such as hormones, has been a big discussion. Basically, trans people should not have to jump through loops to be treated like everyone else in society or with the amount of care and respect that they deserve. Okay, so in this argument, the second one, delusional and deceiving are being lumped in together when they can and do implicate very different things. An example of a transphobic argument that features delusion as its main crutch is that made by, say, U.S. pediatric endocrinologist Dr. Quentin Van Meter. Van Meter claimed that transgender is actually a delusional disorder. It's a state of mind with no biological basis for it that can be found. Now, you've probably already noticed that this language sounds eerily similar to the rhetoric that was once used against gay people. That's because it is. It's actually identical rhetoric. Both arguments are based on rigidity. And something we know very well is that when it comes to sexuality and gender, humans are anything but rigid. The same goes for anything in nature. Aren't there like gay penguins and the male seahorses have the babies? Anyways, let's bring it back and look at the delusion claim for trans people under a magnifying glass. First off, I'm going to say it again. Gender is not biological. It is a social construct. So to say that being transgender is not biological is a false dichotomy because they're not even in the same realm if we're looking at it technically. Another thing important to consider is that this argument seems to insinuate that because, in the mind of a transphobe or TERF, being transgender goes quote-unquote against innate biology, it is wrong. This is really incoherent because why is morality a part of the equation at all if we're talking about things being natural? Why not go against biology? We do it all the time, especially in the medical field. Administering insulin, defibrillators, different kinds of surgery, x-rays. So if we're saying this, then if people like Dr. Van Meter believe that being transgender is wrong because it is not biological, then we'd have to assume the same applies for all other human innovations that aren't natural, like I just said. Now let's move on to the deceptive argument. And I say it like that on purpose because it fits the argument itself. So the first thing that we need to do is ask, what exactly are we being deceived about when it comes to trans people? In TERF ideology, it is widely believed, or it's a core component, that mostly transgender women are deceiving cis women and society at large by pretending they are women, that they somehow get an advantage or some kind of power over cisgender women in particular because they are quote-unquote pretending to be women. I'm going to make a tally mark for every time I have to say this. Gender is not biological. Transgender women are women because they identify as women. They are not men pretending to be or sneaking around as women for any ulterior motive. And this may be leading you to think about the main selling point of both conservative and TERF movements. And that's saying that trans women want to pretend to be women so that they can abuse, and specifically sexually abuse, cisgendered women. You know, the whole bathroom thing. I won't even get into it. Are there any statistics proving this notion? No. You can look it up. I looked it up for sure. There is no evidence that says or proves the idea that trans women have a problem with sexually abusing cisgendered women. There's also no evidence claiming that this is true in relation to the fact or because of the fact that they are transgender. They're not using their gender identity as a Trojan horse kind of thing for abuse. It's just not happening. So I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone in this explanation, because the third claim is that trans women are violators and penetrators of space, of bodies, and of true womanhood, all that. So we've kind of dismantled two in one because they're basically the same arguments. Now, personally, when I was first learning about the world of transphobia and hysteria over queer identities generally, it was a lot easier for me to believe and to accept that the usual suspects, if you will, like conservative movements and mainly men, have these really dangerously close to genocidal ways of thinking about transgender people. But why have women who claim to be feminists taken on this identical line of thinking? Why have they gone down the pipeline? So I definitely think it's a problem with the feminist movement. Historically, mainstream feminist movements have been very exclusionary to everyone else except for middle-class, straight, cis, able-bodied white women. I mean, just as an example off the top of my head, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique doesn't go over women of color, of disabled women, of queer women. So I think that it's a matter of intersectionality. A main part of what I thought about when going into making this video is trying to harp on the fact we need to just constantly remind ourselves how important intersectionality is, because it's very easy for fascist ideology to wiggle its way into so-called progressivism. So I hope that this video made it easier to understand the main basic arguments of TERF ideology and transphobic ideology generally. What are other movements that have co-opted feminism or a leftist movement that you've seen? Well, I'll leave you with that. See you next time.